Hello, Gabriela. Thank you so much for joining me on Culture Chat today.
Hello, Mimi. It's a pleasure to be here.
And we had to really make this work because obviously you are in New Zealand and I'm in Florida. So I know our hours are all mixed up.
That's right. Yes, it is a beautiful autumn morning here in New Zealand. It's Sunday morning, so it's just the perfect time to have a chat.
Yeah, well, I had the pleasure of actually getting to visit New Zealand and I am definitely coming back. I mean, it was gorgeous and I didn't see enough of it. So I kind of envy where you're at right now.
Yes, it is. It is a beautiful country. Of course, I'm not originally from here, but this country has embraced me and my family in such a way that it does feel like home.
Yeah. And where are you originally from?
I'm originally from the very south of Argentina, from a very small place called Ushuaia.
Yes, and we are actually going to definitely get started talking about that very soon because that is kind of where we met. I mean, I don't know if we actually met in Ushuaia, but we met on one of my journeys. My listeners know I like to go all over the world, and one big trip that I had planned for a long time was my South America Antarctica journey. And on that journey, I attended your lectures, and you and the other experts made us feel like we were in a live version of, BBC's Planet Earth or National Geographic. We were going through the ice. We were going by animals and icebergs and glaciers. And you guys were, on the loudspeaker kind of giving us play by play. But in addition, you had these amazing lectures. And it was like, you guys were like the rock stars on the cruise, in all honesty. The place was sold out and people were there like an hour before to grab their seats. And so you guided us through this Antarctic Peninsula in South America and shared all of this amazing history and knowledge. And I was wondering how you kind of got started to give those lectures.
Well, first of all, I'm very glad that you enjoyed the lectures and also the comments that we make when we go through, because we, as a team, we feel very fortunate that people like yourselves are enjoying that, which means that we get hired again and again to do this thing that we love so much. So it is us that need to thank people like you that really enjoy our company on the cruise ship. I started long time ago. I am what we could call a freelance Antarctic and South American naturalist. And so there's as a group of us that the companies that run the cruise ships can hire as a specialist on the areas. And I started really some time ago in the 90s when I was quite young. I was just fresh out of college. I did a lot of my studies in Ushuaia. And so when the opportunity came around, they needed, and one of the cruise ships was missing one expert, and they needed someone that would know the area, particularly Antarctica. They needed someone that had a little bit of expertise, but also could speak English. And luckily, I was sort of at the right place at the right time. I was working for the local government in order to establish a relationship between the cruise ship operators and the locals in Ushuaia, which is this big port that hosts all the operations that come and go to the Antarctic. And so part of my job was to connect with the tour operators, and that's how they got to know me and they got to know of my interest and passion about Antarctica. So it was very fortuitous in that I started, and I've been able to go to Antarctica many times in this role, which is fantastic.
Yes. And now maybe you can explain to our listeners who don't know where Ushuaia is, because that's kind of a reason I mean, in terms of proximity, I guess that's as close as you get, in because we consider this the end of the world, or the city at the end of the world. And it was, it's kind of a big deal when we went there.
Yeah, that is correct. So Ushuaia is a very small frontier town at the very, very south of South America. And you are correct, it's only 620 miles away from the northern tip of the Antarctic Peninsula. So it is a safe harbor. It is the closest port. It's the closest place where you can do all your logistics and operations to launch to the Antarctic. And it is known as the southernmost city in the world because it is located really at the south tip of South America. A lot of people say, oh, yeah, I've been to South America. And then when we start trying to locate ourselves geographically, you need to continue going south and south and south. And pretty much when the maps are, tipping to the end of the frame of the map, that's where Ushuaia is. So the closest thing from there is the mythical Cape Horn, and then the Antarctic. So it is quite southern. Is the southernmost city in the world and is as far south as you can get when you are connecting, if you will, continents.
Yeah, and I remember when we were there, we actually got really lucky. It was this beautiful sunny day, and I had all my jackets on because I'm from Florida, so I was prepared for winter. I'm going to Antarctica. I'm ready, and we get out there in Ushuaia, and it's so sunny and warm. I actually had to take off my jacket, but you had mentioned that you're not considered an Ushuaian or a local unless you've lived through a certain number of winters. They're kind of epic or legendary.
That is correct, yes. And for the locals, that's what shows if you really have a love for the place. How many winters have you spent? It is, if you will, a behavior that you have in lots of places with harsh environments and isolation. So it's not unique of Ushuaia, but it is what people in those places would actually consider as a test of endurance for those that live there. In Ushuaia, the weather can change very rapidly, very quickly, because not only it's so close to the Antarctic, but it is located right on the edge of the Beagle Channel. And this channel runs pretty much west to east on the southernmost part of the big island of Tierra del Fuego. So the prevailing winds are from the west and southwest. They bring a lot of cold, a lot of moisture, not only from the Southern Ocean, but from Antarctica as well. And so precipitation, rain, hail, snow can happen at any time of the year. It doesn't have to be either winter or summer. We were in a beautiful and exceptional day in Ushuaia when we were visiting. I have to say, it was just one of those amazing days that the locals do remember. And sometimes when you're chatting with a local, they say, "Oh, they take it as almost as a landmark." They say, "Oh, remember that day, that sunny day?" And then they carry on with what they're telling you. So that they're very, very special. You were a lucky person to be there on that spectacular day, because I think the place is beautiful. It's just the setting, the natural settings are just wonderful, and being able to see the peak of the mountains and the channel, etc., is just gives you an understanding of really where you are.
Yeah, and I got a kind of little bit of a taste of local life while I was there. I wrote about it in my blog, and I was fortunate because my husband and I and our friends, we walked into a comic book shop because we're kind of comic book geeks, and it was really exciting for my friend because he also owns a comic book shop in Boston, and we were connecting, and luckily my husband speaks Spanish, so they were dialoguing, and then they offered me some of their yerba mate, the tea, and I didn't understand really at that time because I'm a little bit of a misophobe, so I was like, oh my gosh, I'm gonna be sharing a drink with a stranger I've never met, but he was so excited to offer it to me, and so I took a sip. I went through it, and then after I left, I remember reading somewhere that was like a really big sign of kind of being accepted into the culture.
That is correct. Yes. So in Argentina, it's very popular to drink mate, which is this green tea, if you like. Although locals will smile at the definition of green tea. And the mate is crushed leaves. It's that from a bush that grows in the northeast part of Argentina, near the Iguazu Falls, in a very lush sort of subtropical area. And the leaves get dried and crushed, and then you put that in a gourd with a straw, and then you pour hot water into it. Depending on the regions of Argentina, some people will add the zest of a citrus, or sometimes a little bit of sugar, or peppermint. So it depends, but most people will just take it in that natural way, which has a bitter taste, and it's quite an acquired taste. So I'm very happy that you actually tried it, because it is socially, it means you're accepted in the group. It is the drink for a social gathering. It's in a way the equivalent, if you will, for the cup of tea that comes from England, that if you have a problem, you have a cup of tea and you share your problems with your friends. Here is the same. There's a gathering of friends or acquaintances, and the mate will start rolling around. And yes, the whole idea is that people will share the same straw and the same gourd. You don't have individual mates to go around. But so, yeah, you're very brave, because a lot of people just consider that, no, it's not their kind of thing. And then that's a fair enough. Here in New Zealand, when I drink mate in public places, some people wonder if I'm drinking something that is perhaps not so legal, and I can understand why the looks I get, but it is a very popular drink in the southern parts of South America, also in parts of Chile, Brazil, Peru, and Uruguay for sure.
Yeah, I mean, it was bitter, but I'm a big tea drinker and I drink loose leaf tea. So I was okay. It was more of the experience. But again, when I'm in another culture, my goal is to really absorb and just kind of entrench myself. So it was a good experience for me overall. But I kind of got a chuckle. My husband got a chuckle about it. Oscar was laughing at me because he knows me, but I was the only one they offered it to. And so I felt so, I just didn't really know. It was unexpected, but it was quite nice. And after hearing about what it means, it made me really happy that I was so welcoming of that, because normally I could be very off-putting with sharing the straw. And the straw is now, it's like metal, so it's not, when we say straw, we're thinking of those plastic to-go cups, but these are like metal straws. And when Gabriela is saying a gourd, I mean, it literally looks like some sort of vegetable, and like you said, they're just crushed leaves in there. So I can see why you might get some raised eyebrows in New Zealand.
That's correct. Yes. So it is essentially a dried gourd that it's selected specially for becoming a mate, and you call yerba mate, which is the herb for the mate. And the straw, it's a metal straw, and it has a strainer at the bottom. So essentially, when you're drinking the mate, you are sipping through essentially the tea, the drink, not the leaves. Yeah.
Yeah. And are there other like traditions or things that kind of specifically from Ushuaia, or is it more South American, but are there more specific to, being that end of the world, kind of city that you guys kind of have that kind of make you your own?
Well, the people in Ushuaia, Ushuaia, it's located in a relatively small island, although locals want to call it, it's a big island. And the actual name is, with very little imagination, called Big Island, Isla Grande, of the whole archipelago of Tierra del Fuego, the land of fire. which is a mythical archipelago because back in the 1500s, Magellan named this land, even though he never set foot on this land, even though he never really explored it. He was just going through the northern part, discovering what later will become the Strait of Magellan, which is specifically the southernmost portion of the South American continent. And then you have this large fragmented archipelago and called Tierra del Fuego. Magellan saw the fires lit by the natives, and that's how he called it, and it translated through time. So even before the land was known to, say, the Western civilization, it already had a name, it had a place in world maps, which is absolutely fantastic. It was even known as probably the pathway to the terra incognita, the unknown land that the Greeks have talked about millennia before, which was, essentially Antarctica. They thought that there was an opposite to the Arctos, the northern regions, and the opposite to Arctos is Antarctus, Antarctica. And so back in the days, the explorers were looking for this terra incognita, unknown land, and Tierra del Fuego became sort of the passageway to that unknown land. It was the last bastion, if you will, of the world that explorers knew of. So in Ushuaia and the other two populations that live in this large Tierra del Fuego, one is called Rio Grande, which is north of Ushuaia, and another one, El Porvenir, in Tierra del Fuego, Chile, because this archipelago is shared between Argentina and Chile. Everyone in the whole island call themselves Fuegians or Fueguinos. So within the Fueguinos, if you will, some of the, I wouldn't say tradition, but the taste of whether you are a Fueguino or not is like we were talking about before. How many winters have you spent in the area? And also whether you are, they have if you will, a classification for Fueguinos, those that were born and bred and stayed, and those were born and bred and left, and those that were arrived and stayed. And so I was an arrived and stayed, and then my, if you will, my social status will go up or down depending on how many winters, what sort of jobs have I done, and whether I was integrated into the community. I went to Ushuaia quite young, and as a young woman, of course, you like to look good and attractive, and it was very difficult in a place with a lot of harsh and climate, lots of snow, people that don't really clean up the footpaths, and so it was very difficult. I realized that walking on with high heels, it was kind of challenging at the best of times. So very, very quickly, I learned with my other friends that, for example, you would have winter jackets and summer jackets. Now, for everybody else in the world, unless you live in a very cold place, that means a thinner or a more substantial jacket to withstand the cold. This meant the same sort of jacket, but lighter colors, more lively colors for summer, yellows and reds and so on, and then darker colors for the winter because, well, it's winter, it's dark, and it gets dark very, very quickly in the afternoon. So, you kind of blend with the day. But, they're interesting, if you will, adaptations that you go through once you are settled in that kind of environment. And one of the perhaps the most common things that happen is that a lot of people move to Ushuaia quite young, and therefore I call it a town without grandparents. So when you're raising your children, you don't have that support family to help you like you would pretty much anywhere else in the world. And so your support network becomes your friends, your neighbors, and so on. So it is a town where children call auntie or uncle to people that are not blood related at all, but it does create that sense of community for sure.
Oh, wow. That's fascinating. And so I do want to jump on something you said earlier, which was, of course, we started to bring up Magellan and the Strait of Magellan. And, I chuckled with everyone when I got home how, I was going down the route of the explorers and we were going through the ocean while I sat in the comfort of my warm cruise ship. But even still, the sea got a little bit rough, and it's very known to be quite crazy down there. When we were in Chile, the guide that was taking us around, I think we were in Puerto Montt, and he goes, those, it could be 10, 12 meters, and you'll be sick the whole time, and you could see the top of the wave. And he told me what he went through, and I was shaking in my boots. And we again got really lucky because our captain was amazing. He kind of waited in the channel for the best opportunity. We did get some major waves, but it's kind of a known area where the seas can be very rough. And I understand also I remember you talked about the other explorers, the later explorers like Shackleton and all these other ones that went to Antarctica, and that was a very common port because it's pretty much the last stop before you go. So I mean, it's pretty popular for ships, maybe not cruise ships, now cruise ships, but at the time it was really an explorer route.
Yes, that is correct. So the early 1900s is when brings a lot of the explorers to look at Antarctica. This is a very interesting era because the civilized world, if you will, by the late 1800s, dictate that the southernmost continent, which by now we have an idea that it is there because of previous explorations of others. They were German and French and British and some American sealers and whalers that had been to if you will, Antarctica. They were interested in the coastline. No one had explored inland. And at the beginning of the 1900s, so I'm talking about only 118 years ago, people did not know if this was actually a full continent or it was a string of islands connected by an ice cap, or what was it really? And so there is a mandate that they need to explore, and they need to explore it inland, particularly because this will be the last part of the world that would be explored. So there is fame and fortune, if you will, for those that will actually do this kind of exploration. And many countries become very excited, particularly because we're in an era of expansion and nationalism. And so countries wanted to conquer and keep. And that was the whole idea. But getting back to your question, yes, lots of different explorers decided to tackle this southern continent in different ways. They knew that New Zealand was relatively close to an area called the Ross Sea. They have been exploring there. They knew that, for example, from the south of Africa, you had quite a long way to get to Antarctica, and there was a lot of ice as well. And now we understand why the southern, if you will, if you travel south from South Africa and Australia, it's very difficult to get to the coast of Antarctica. And so the Antarctic Peninsula sticking out a little bit further north in like a long arm, it provided that access to the continent, and they needed to explore that. So we have explorers that went through the ports of Punta Arenas in the southern part of Chile, and also Ushuaia. Ushuaia was very small settlement that could provide some coal, some food, some fresh water, and also some timber. But Punta Arenas, which we visited during the cruise you did, was the, if you will, that gateway to the south. And we had explorers like well, the French were there with the Belgians as well. We had explorers like Shackleton that had to go through Punta Arenas in order to rescue his men from the fantastic, heroic trip of the Endurance. That was the name of the ship that got trapped on ice on the Weddell Sea in 1916. We have the Belgium, the Gerlache, that at the end of the 1800s decides to stop by in Punta Arenas, grab a few more things and head south. He was heading south quite late and he got trapped on ice, and the ship actually survived, and they became the first ones to winter in the Antarctic Peninsula, and they understood a lot of what was happening there with the sea ice formation and the currents as well. Then we had the French Charcot that went through the southern part of South America. Nordenskiöld, which was a Swedish geologist, he also explored Tierra del Fuego proper and then headed south. So the area was very well known. We were really in the footsteps of many of these very brave men that were adventuring not only the really rough seas, that we got just a taste of it, because of course we were in a very comfortable ship and a very large and fast ship. So back in the days, in their smaller sort of wooden made with reinforced hull ships, explorers would have cross the Drake Passage in about 7 to 9 days. We did it in 37 hours. So you can imagine a little bit going in a much smaller ship, the ordeals that they would have to go through just by crossing that water that separates the two continents. And then what? You don't know what to expect. People didn't know even whether there were humans in Antarctica or monsters or, Yeti-like living things. It was really exciting times, but when you think about it, it's just amazing that it only happened just 100 years or so ago.
Yeah, I was really fascinated by the entire trip. And like I said, I chuckled because, here we are in the comfort of this cruise liner. But it was fascinating to hear all of the stories that you shared. And of course, we don't have time to go into great detail, but I know there was always, that race to be the first, the first to, like you said, winter over, or the first to, get to that South Pole. And there was, kind of that, like you said, fame and glory and wanting to be the first there. In terms of actually finally now, we get to Antarctica and on our cruise ship, and we had, again, it was like sunshine, and I couldn't even believe we were in this, mythical place of ice. And then 2 days later, we got to see the other side of Antarctica, which was probably very mild compared to any of their winters. But, there was, snow, ice going sideways. And I went outside because I wanted the experience, and I had like this thing on my face because it was hazy. We couldn't see anything. And the most fascinating day to me, actually, although I enjoyed the beautiful sunny day, was the day where, we were trying to get in, and we kept trying to get around the ice, and we were getting, kind of we were listening to your voices. We're always listening for your voices. What's happening next? We're trying to get around, but we don't want to get too close to the iceberg. I mean, the word iceberg and cruise ship, is a little stressful, historically speaking. And so, but it was a very fascinating thing. Like, it really made me feel like what an explorer might have even felt like, wow, we're trying to break through, we couldn't see Elephant Island because it was just foggy. And that whole experience was really surreal to me. It was very exciting, and I couldn't even imagine being in this smaller boat that takes 8 days longer versus 30 hours, and just the conditions that they were in. I mean, I saw the movie Shackleton, and so they painted a pretty clear picture of how rough it got, but I couldn't even imagine, and so it definitely was an exciting time. But even for me, just to kind of hear you talk about it, and of course Dr. Peter and Margaret, and it was such a cool experience.
Well, that's great to hear, because that's what we bring back, as well. That's what we feel. Um, I have to say that even though I've traveled to Antarctica many times, every time it's a new adventure, because the weather changes quite quickly. We're in an area that it is covered by miles and miles and miles of ice, and you've got the wind, and you've got the ocean action. And so all that compound, it does create for a very challenging environment, no matter where you are. So we did have the fantastic, blue skies, no wind days, but we did have some other challenging days, and that is the real Antarctica as well. You get the two extremes, if you will. And even though today we have comfortable ships, lots of communication, technological devices that will allow us to sail safely and be able to try to see these places and show you all these amazing places, we still have the challenge that, well, it is a difficult place to be in, and that's why the if you will, the margin of traveling to Antarctica, it's a very narrow margin, it's a very narrow window to go there. And particularly what captains of ships are more concerned, as you said, it's icebergs, but not the big ones that we have, because those are obvious. There will be no captain that wants to get too close to them, but they also show in our satellite devices, so we know pretty much where they are, where they're moving, how big they are, or how large they are underwater. But sea ice and smaller fractions of ice that we when looking for, which were called growlers, and the name comes from the explorers. These are extremely compressed pieces of ice. In most cases, they are transparent, and they have lost a lot of the mass that is above water. So they're normally floating at a sea level, and you need human eye, well-trained humans, to look at that. And although you could experience all this exciting moments, and going out and on deck, you would have felt, as you said, the cold and the snow just hitting your face, because it was coming literally horizontal. On the bridge where we were talking to the guests on board, the work there, it's quite intense. Not only you have 3 captains, because we had our captain, then there is a staff captain, which is the deputy captain, and then there was an ice pilot, which was essentially assessing the situation, in assisting the captain into making the best decisions. The ship is also a training ship for officers, and so there was a whole crew getting trained into navigating through these polar waters. So there's a lot of people there, and at the same time, everybody was excited but focused into what was the task ahead, which was avoid ice, but get close enough so people can actually experience Antarctica. It's a very thin margin, if you will, and that's one of the things that excite me the most, that not to be in an unsafe environment, but to experience that full force of Antarctica and know that we are in a safe environment and comfortable as well. Because if you feel too cold, you go and grab a hot cup of chocolate, and life is good. Yes.
Yeah, it is definitely, in my view, the way to see Antarctica. I know a lot of people want to go and do the trek, and I hope to have Dr. Margaret on and Dr. Peter on later. I mean, she was talking about, she was, one of the women who did expeditions there, and her slideshow was, I would rather just be viewing the slideshow. There's no way I'm going to be, staying in a little tunnel of ice or whatever to use the bathroom, and the conditions that she described were insane. But definitely, it painted a clear picture, even what we were doing in our luxury and everything. It was really fascinating and definitely unforgettable. We haven't discussed at all, and maybe this is more, of course, Dr. Peter's specialty. I actually got really lucky because you and he were looking to eat lunch for like 5 minutes because you had to run back up to the bridge, and I ended up saying, hey, come sit with us. Don't worry, eat and run. And we got to talk to you for a little bit, and that was fantastic. But I felt a little bit like I was with my, my 9th grade science teacher, because I started to tell him about the birds that he was talking about at the lecture. And he goes, okay, that's correct. And, I felt like I was in a little bit of a science class, and I didn't know if I was going to fail the test. But I learned so much about all the animals. And we haven't even talked about, of course, the penguins that we would get to see on icebergs, as we, cruise on by, and they would just jump into the water. I mean, it was a really phenomenal thing. And then on Falkland, we were going to Volunteer Point, where the penguin, colonies are for the king and the Magellan and all different kinds. And the tour guide told me, we get some pretty painful tourist questions, and we wanted to know what those were. And he said, well, some people ask us, do you eat the penguins? And where do you put the penguins at night? And are you afraid they're going to fly away? And, so we got a good laugh of that. But for those who've never seen pictures or anything, Volunteer Point, basically, there's just thousands of penguins in little circles and huddles, if you will. Like, you just see bunches, different penguins all over, and they just free roam. So so in a way, people think that they're pets to these landowners or something, right? And so what are some of the common misconceptions or questions maybe you've gotten because you've gone on so many trips to Antarctica and South America, like, from guests, like what are the biggest misconceptions? And then I do want to quickly later to kind of address like what we were talking about with the ice and maybe how the climate has been affecting it. Because, I mean, I know when we were there, we had the scientists come on board and kind of address some of that as well. So, but what are some of the crazy questions you've gotten?
Well, yeah, there are lots of misconceptions because we look at penguins and we look at them as little humans, really. We find that they have all these characteristics of a little person. And so we want to make them more human than what they are. They are seabirds. And a lot of people that don't like birds, they don't want to call them seabirds or see them as seabirds. They question whether they are half of a fish or a mammal, but no, they're not. They are a bird. They hatch from an egg. They're covered in feathers, and they are birds. Some of the other misconceptions is the monogamy that penguins, that we were told and led to believe that this happens. Penguins really are, if you will, monogamous if both male and female know what to do at the time of breeding, know what to do at the time of rearing the chicks. So essentially, this is a very practical, if you will, way. If they are successful in sharing the chores of rearing the chicks, then male and female will establish a bond for the following season. And so they meet again at the end of that long winter, and they breed again. They will look for each other. They will try to find that partner because evolutionarily, that is a successful partner. That is a partner that not only share the chores but has the genes to procreate a healthy and successful, chick. And so that's the part of the monogamy that we try to think. Or, for example, the practicality of penguins. If that's not my child, I'm not feeding it. So people feel that, first of all, mom is only the one feeding. No, that chick wouldn't survive. It was only mom feeding. Dad has to do its own work. And a lot of people think that, well, the mom surely takes over for a longer period than the dad does. No, it has to be 50-50. Otherwise, the adult doesn't survive or the chick doesn't survive. I've been asked questions about their feelings. There's no such a thing. We don't believe that the birds will have a feeling. But I had situations that were quite intriguing, I guess, working near a penguin colony, and I was standing by a penguin colony for a long time, and I was helping out with the people that were there and running a few jobs here and there, and a penguin chick just stood by me. Now, every time I moved, it will move with me. He or she, I wouldn't know what it was. And my colleagues thought that, first of all, because I'm relatively short and I was dressed in a floating suit, which was a whole one suit that was black and with some white, they thought I was, adopting the penguin. But yeah, so I have had situations where penguins either they come up to you, they crawl on you, and they're looking for essentially to be fed. And once they realize that you're not feeding them, they all just run away. So there have been, there are several interesting situations, but I think the one that strikes me the most is how we all tend to look at penguins as if they are little people. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's not like Happy Feet then, the movie. It's not like that. They don't sing these amazing songs to each other and find the love of their life and then that's it.
Never seen such a thing happening, but you never know, right? But just wanted to add a little thing about you went to Volunteer Point in the Falkland Islands, in South Georgia, and obviously in Antarctica. All these places where the penguins are, they are just in their natural environment. They arrive there before humans arrive to these places. And so it's a question of learning how to interact with the wildlife. For many of the Falkland Islanders, it was fencing out for their farm to allow for penguins to be there. And essentially, there's no facilities, as you have seen. There's nowhere to have a cup of a hot drink or anything like that. So many of the places that we went on this South American cruise, they were a fantastic example of how elsewhere in the world we can interact and share the environment with the wildlife without really impacting on each other. So just a little thing there.
Well, that was kind of a concern because when we were there with the penguins, they said, if the penguin's trying to go towards you or cross you, just stop, let it go. Especially if it's coming back from the water, that means they probably have the fish in their mouth. And if you frighten it or try to touch it, it could swallow it. And, if you've seen any documentary, it's like a whole situation to go back out there and get that fish and then come all the way back. I mean, it is not a simple, let me just go catch a fish and come back thing, So I I was concerned about, are we as humans always disturbing the nature? Are we making an impact? Are we changing the course of what's quote unquote natural? I mean, and I guess, through evolution and the nature of life and how we are going to, kind of crisscross with animals and nature, that does happen. But it does look like when we were there at the colonies, they do a really good job of making sure like the humans are not in contact. There's like little stones that you have to stay on the outside of. And if the penguin, most people are respectful, but I don't have the great trust in humans that I'd like to have. And I always feel like there's always some person there that's chasing the penguin, trying to touch it. And, they kind of may end up ruining it for everybody where, maybe they will stop these penguin tours one day and say it's too invasive or it's too much contact. But in my experience, they didn't really care we were there. They didn't seem to mind us. And, it was more like you said, like, if you don't have fish, you're of no interest to me. And they just kind of went on their way. But in terms of human impact, I did want to talk a little bit about, because you've been to the region so much, if you've seen, even since you've been going, like anything different because of climate change and how I remember we had talked about that I guess it was an iceberg that broke or had a crevice or something happened like within the last year. And are there any impacts that you've noticed?
Yes, I have been going down to the Antarctic for the last 20 odd years, so I have seen some changes that could be connected and related to climate change as a overall, if you will, phenomenon. I go mostly to the Antarctic Peninsula, which is the area that, with plenty of scientific evidence, has been the one that has changed the most in the last 20, 30 years. Some of the changes that I've noticed, just at first glance, you just look at it and think, wow, this is different. For example, some penguin colonies have changed the species that was there before, and now there's a new penguin species so they're not invasive, but what is happening is that some penguin species are better adapted or better suited for a colder environment, and they're also interested in certain food that can be found in areas where there's more sea ice, for example. Penguins are quite picky about what they eat in the different species. So I have seen, for example, an abundance of a particular penguin species, the Gin2, that previously in my first few trips to the Antarctic were in the northern margins of the Antarctic Peninsula, and now you can see them populating further and further south. That means that they are displacing others, and it's not that they compete, not just the competition for the area where they're going to breed, but it's mostly the species that were previously there, for example, cannot find the right conditions. There's not enough sea ice. There's not, for example, there's more precipitation in the northern parts of the Antarctic Peninsula, which means that a lot of water, a lot of snow, a lot of rain, and that means you can't really build your nest and lay your eggs because they're going to be wet all the time with all that melting water coming through. So they need to find for areas that are either colder with less precipitation, they're drier, and therefore that's more suited for their environment. We tend to relate climate change with these big pieces of ice that we see in the media breaking through. That scientists are still debating whether these are processes that happen because of climate change. Now, we know that in every, the way that Antarctica works is like massive glaciers all connected. And so the fact that they have to discharge some of the ice, it's pretty natural. But of course, in Antarctica, with the volume of ice we have this massive chunks of ice that make it for more dramatic, if you will, scenes and also media worthy news. But at the same time, that means that these changes are happening faster than what we used to record before. And so scientists are trying to determine what are the changes and why is Antarctica essentially discharging more ice than what it should be. The other difference that we find is also in the ocean acidification, changes in the ocean, because the ocean absorbs a lot of the carbon that is within our atmosphere. And that means that the composition of the ocean changes, and that's where all the food chain, the productivity of the ocean is. So sometimes we're looking for obvious changes in the space that we are. A lot of people say, well, half a degree warmer, what's not to like with that? That impacts elsewhere. And those changes are sometimes not as visible to the human eye as they are in a detail, for example. As I said, composition of the ocean, how is that affecting the productivity, the food, for all the wildlife that we like to see and that we love so much from these polar regions. Ice. Why is so important? We tend to think about ice and sea level rise and what is the immediate consequences to humans that live in a coastal area. But before that happens, there are different other changes that are in a way affecting the environment before it actually connects to us. We have to be a little bit less selfish in thinking about climate change and how it's going to impact on me and more on the world that we're living in.
Yeah, I'm learning so much. I'm just in awe right now. I'm like, okay, let me keep taking. I'm in my science class again. No, but it's so. I think it's so important, and it's important we have these conversations and we continue to learn and we continue to educate, because every time I went to one of the lectures or I read up on stuff, you just learn more, because like you said, new discoveries are being made and all different parts of nature. And it's not necessarily what we think we obviously see. I mean, even when we were in South America, they said that's where the ozone was more depleted and had all the, which was so sad, because we're sitting here in this beautiful Patagonia where you feel like, oh, this is nature. This must be the most, the most natural place and healthiest place. And they said, well, no, everyone here has skin cancer because that if you don't put sunblock, I mean, it's so depleted. And I could actually feel, the difference when we were that far south versus, and I'm in Florida, it's pretty hot. And there was a very physical, difference in how you felt and what they explained. So it isn't always, like you said, what's the obvious, but I find it something that, that's really important that we all should be more aware of, So the last thing I'm going to pick your brain about, and I know, I like I said, I could talk to you all day because you're so knowledgeable, and I just love to learn. But I remember in your lectures, you showed a chart, and of course, there's Argentina and Chile and all these other regions, and everyone's kind of quote unquote staking their claim in Antarctica, and there's kind of this like conflict and fight. Like, if it depends on whose map you're looking at, which little pie of Antarctica belongs to who, because there's no real kind of quote unquote claim at this point. And then you told me that they would like bring their pregnant, wives down there so there could be a firstborn in Antarctica. And there was like always kind of a fight for this, new, like you said, new continent. So I thought you maybe could share a little bit about that.
Sure. Well, Antarctica right now, and since the 1960s, 1961 is when the Antarctic Treaty gets signed and ratified by this group of nations that decided, well, actually, this is the last pristine place on Earth, and we need to protect it. Scientists of these 12 countries that are the original signatories of the Antarctic Treaty, decided that they needed to convince their governments that this place, it was worth keeping it the way it was. No wars had to happen here, and it was a live laboratory, essentially. And so this is if you will, quite an interesting concept that suddenly people stop fighting for obtaining pieces of land, of no man's land, and decide to together look after this place. So the Antarctic Treaty is a very interesting, very short international agreement, and it is so far the only international agreement that has worked in our world. From those 12 countries, now we have 53 countries that have signed the treaty and abide by this legislation. But also there are more countries wanting to step into this club, if you will, of conservationists and protectionists of this wilderness. But of course, by the time we get to signing the treaty, which is the end of the 1950s, and the world has gone through 2 world wars, and the Cold War is brewing there, and there's a lot of fighting, and etc. Antarctica was seen as, okay, let's go and grab this part of this place. And so there are 7 claims that were made to the Antarctic before the Antarctic Treaty was signed. And these claims were done mostly either to obtain benefits with regards to fishing or whaling fees and whaling permits. They were also with the idea of the prospect of minerals and water, or what's in there. Also at the time, not only whaling was one of the commercial activities, but also we were looking at seals. And although there was a referendum stopping sealing because we almost depleted all the populations of seals in the world, there was a referendum stopping that activity to allow the numbers to grow. So we're still looking at Antarctica in the 1950s as a place with lots of natural resources where we can grab, either for now or for the future. So Antarctica has today this 7 claims that, because the treaty is in place, have been set aside. It means that no one else really cares for the claim but yourself if you have made a claim. And so countries like Argentina and Chile, which have claims that overlap with the British claim over the Antarctic Peninsula, went to the extreme of, for example, like you said, flying pregnant women to the different research stations because the proximity of their homelands allow them to do that, and have babies born in the Antarctic in order to strengthen their claims over this extension of their countries, if you will, which of course the audacity of this whole thing just put people in awe, because they just couldn't believe that this was happening. But the first baby was born in the Antarctic in 1978, and he was born from a couple, from an Argentine couple. So the first baby born, Emilio Victor Palma, he was born in an Argentine base, and also created an interesting situation, political situation, because he's born on an area that was claimed by Britain and also Chile. So these 2 other countries had to make the decision of whether to offer the nationality to this child of both countries, or to sustain from doing that. Neither did so, and the child is an Argentine citizen, if you will, and people in both Argentina and Chile see it as a normal thing, as a normal practice, that Argentine or Chilean children will be born in this extension of the Argentine or Chilean territory.
Wow.
Yeah. And there are little settlements there, 2 research stations, or under the name of research stations, for both Argentina and Chile. and they have a little school where children attend school in the Antarctic. They have a little village community hall. There's a post office and even an ATM. So if you have places where to spend your money in Antarctica, which there are not that many really, you can always withdraw some of your own cash in the Antarctic. Bizarre, I know.
It's very bizarre, and it's just bizarre to even think in the near future. You may meet someone that's like, yeah, I was born in Antarctica. It's just that it has its own little culture now, which is unlike anywhere else in the world, really.
That is correct. That is correct. And the culture and the place is just like nowhere else in the world. It's just fantastic, unique, and very, very special.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you've been so gracious with your time, but I think in the near future, maybe I'll have you on again. We can talk about New Zealand, and we can kind of go. There was some other things that you talked about in your lectures that, women in Antarctica, and hopefully Dr. Margaret Bradshaw will be on with that too. And you have so much knowledge, and I love talking to you, and you have this fabulous voice. And so, and it's been great to get to know you. So, Gabriela Roldan, everybody, thank you so much for joining me today.
It was my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me, Mimi.
That's all for today's episode. Thanks for listening to Culture Chat and hope you enjoyed the conversation. Please subscribe and rate my podcast. Feel free to leave me suggestions or send an email to mimi@culturechatpodcast.com or follow me on social media at Sifu Mimi Chan on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook.